Okay, we're going to talk about the U.S. involvement in World War One and how it resulted in an expanded role of government. So we're going to focus on the effects here, but if I was looking at causes here, one of the categories that I might use was something about the progressive influence on the role of government. In the progressive movement, they use government to regulate business with antitrust laws. They use government to regulate society with like the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act. They use government for purposes to improve society, to get involved in more in people's lives. That's one of the categories here. Other categories could deal with kind of like the causes of how the United States became involved in World War One, things like the Zimmerman Note and the resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare by the Germans and the sinking of the Lusitania. Wilson's desire for neutrality, those kinds of things might be on the cause side here. But for the effect side, we're going to look at our first category is expansion of the military. And I think the most important thing here is the Selective Service Act, which is a law that was passed that was the military draft, where all men over the age of 18 to 24, I think, had to register with the government and put their names in for the draft so they could be forced to join the military. You also have things like Liberty bonds and new taxes that were increased. So, in order to pay for the war, right? So, this is more government involvement. Basically, the government is using more of taxpayers' money to produce more things for the war. And you have the War Industries Board, which was kind of a way to coordinate the war efforts so that ships being produced or uniforms or weapons or whatever it is that the government was kind of coordinating those efforts among the different companies. So it's the government getting involved in business and sort of not telling what business should be doing, but kind of helping and working with business to produce what they needed for the war. Okay, second category here is this increased role in domestic affairs. So just the government's role in people's everyday lives changed during World War One. So you have the National War Labor Board, which was kind of a way for unions, because during a war, one of the things you don't want is you don't want workers to stop working to produce the things you need for the war. So this was an effort to kind of like make sure that the unions and the workers kept working and didn't stop, go on strike or anything like that. So this was kind of an advantage for workers. So it kind of helped their conditions a little bit here. They got better pay, they got better working conditions in exchange for not going on strike during the war. You also have the Committee on Public Information, which is kind of this propaganda effort by George Creel, which is a name you should know, who was trying to organize support for the war. So this is propaganda posters, it's propaganda films. You have these 5-minute men that gave speeches before, like people would go to the movies. Before the movie would start, a guy would stand up who would talk about the virtues of buying Liberty bonds or the idea of conserving energy or food or whatever it is so that could be used for the war effort. People on street corners and public events, right? So these speech makers were really trying to convince people. You also have those propaganda posters. There's the famous, Uncle Sam, I Want You poster. There's posters for Liberty bonds. There's posters for, advertising for like Meatless Mondays, that sort of thing. So, and the idea here was to promote this idea of social unity, which is kind of like we're all in this together. We all have a role to play in this war effort. So, again, the government is trying to drum up support and get support for the war so that people are enthused about it, are excited about it, are excited about contributing to the war effort, even if they're not actually fighting directly in Europe. And then lastly, our last category here is the expansion on the limitations of civil liberties. So civil liberties are like rights, like freedom of speech, for example. And we have laws passed like the Sedition Act and the Espionage Act, which kind of limited how you could criticize the government. It said that you could not criticize the draft, you couldn't criticize the government, you couldn't criticize the president, those kinds of things. And those all seem to be against the First Amendment, the freedom of speech. And the reason these were passed was because it was a target for socialists, because socialists were opposed to this war. They were pacifists mostly. They didn't want to get involved in any kind of war. So it was targeting these anti-war groups, but particularly socialists. And the Supreme Court, in a Supreme Court case called Schenck versus U.S., they actually sided with the government here and said it was okay for the government to limit people's freedom of speech like this during wartime. They said it created a clear and present danger to the war effort. So we see this happen a lot during war where people's civil liberties or rights are more limited. Okay, so what we see here in World War I is this expanded role of government in these other ways. Most of these are temporary in terms of specifically during war, but it does create kind of opens the door and creates the possibilities for more government intervention later on, and sort of provides a template for what happens in World War II.